January 12, 1944. A thin layer of frost covers the wooden guard towers of Camp Clinton, Mississippi. Dawn is just breaking and a cold mist drifts between the barracks. Inside the fenced compound, hundreds of German prisoners of war stand silently in formation. These are men who once marched across Europe under the iron fist of the Wehrmacht, men for whom an officer's word was absolute law. Among them, a young corporal stares in disbelief. Just beyond the wire, two American soldiers are arguing with their superior officer. Their voices are firm, their gestures sharp. But the officer just listens, his arms crossed, his posture relaxed. The entire exchange lasts only a few seconds, but for the men behind that fence, it shatters a lifetime of certainty. How could this be? In the German army, this kind of insubordination would bring severe, unforgettable consequences. Yet here, on foreign soil, these American soldiers were speaking to power as if it were their right. This small moment revealed a deep philosophical divide between the two armies. One was built on fear and rigid hierarchy. The other was shaped by a democratic culture. For years, Nazi propaganda had hammered home the idea that the American military was undisciplined, weak-willed, an army of amateurs. But what these prisoners were seeing with their own eyes contradicted everything they had been told. And it wasn't just the arguments. It was something much more mundane, something that happened every single day. The clatter of a tin mess tray. This simple object was a constant, echoing reminder of equality. At every meal, officers and enlisted men stood in the same lines, received their food on the same metal trays, and ate the same rations. For German soldiers whose entire world was defined by rank, even down to how and what they ate, this was a mind-bending detail. As the weeks turned into months, the prisoners realized that morning argument wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. They saw American soldiers debating logistics, questioning assignments they felt were inefficient, and raising concerns without any fear of punishment. The sound of boots on gravel was often followed by the sound of firm, respectful dissent, a rhythm completely alien to men raised in an authoritarian system. Historical records from the Office of War Information showed just how stunned the German POWs were by this informality. In post-war interviews, many recalled that the American soldiers seemed unburdened by fear. One German sergeant later wrote in his memoirs that the Americans argued, yes, but they argued because they expected to be heard. It was so unbelievable that at camps across the country, from Algona to Stockton, German prisoners repeatedly asked if these disagreements were staged for morale. They simply couldn't accept that open discussion was a normal part of military life. And yet every day the evidence was undeniable. The clatter of the mess trays reaffirmed it. During inspections, the contrast was stark. German captives stood rigidly, silently. Nearby, their American guards joked, debated, and voiced frustrations without even lowering their heads. American officers gave commands, but not with the icy finality of a system demanding blind obedience. Instead, orders often came with explanations, adjustments, and sometimes even negotiation. Slowly, the initial shock of the prisoners turned into curiosity. They began to study the Americans not just as enemies, but as representatives of a system they had been taught to despise. They started asking themselves profound questions. How could an army function without fear? Why didn't discipline collapse when soldiers were allowed to raise their voices? Why did officers tolerate dissent? The answer, they began to realize, wasn't in the army itself, but in the society it came from. Democracy, which their own military manuals had described as chaotic and inefficient, was revealing itself to be something far more resilient. It gave the individual a voice, even in the middle of a war. This didn't weaken discipline. It strengthened it by fostering a sense of shared purpose and participation. And that humble mess tray, passing through the hands of every man regardless of rank, became the quiet, powerful symbol of that shared status. This transformation is documented. War Department records note that many German POWs completely revised their opinions of American society after witnessing its military culture. Some wrote that the experience challenged the very core of their beliefs. One prisoner said he had never imagined an army where men obeyed because they chose to, not because they feared punishment. Another recalled that democracy had always seemed like an abstract idea to him, until he heard an enlisted man openly disagree with an officer. In the grand story of the war, these quiet observations in a Mississippi prison camp mattered deeply. They proved the conflict wasn't just a clash of armies, but a collision of worldviews. The German soldiers had entered these camps believing they were fighting a disorganized, undisciplined force. What they found instead was a system built on voluntary commitment, individual dignity, and shared responsibility, the very values that Nazi ideology had worked so hard to discredit. By the time spring arrived, many German POWs looked at the Americans with a new kind of respect. They began to understand that the strength of the US military didn't just come from its tanks and planes, but from its underlying philosophy. And through it all, the mess tray continued its daily journey from hand to hand, a simple, clattering emblem of equality that dismantled everything they had been taught to believe about power and authority. Years later, long after the war was over, former prisoners reflected on what they had seen. They remembered the frosty mornings, the arguments carried on the Mississippi air, and the stunning realization that discipline could exist without terror. They remembered how a small, scratched, unremarkable piece of metal had become a symbol of a world where the individual mattered. Ultimately, this story is more than just a wartime curiosity. It has a window into a larger truth that the war itself revealed, that the strength of a free society lies not in silence, but in voice, not in rigid obedience, but in a shared purpose. As the final echoes of those mess trays faded from the camps they left behind, a quiet testament to the power of a system built on equality, a system that could surprise, challenge, and ultimately transform even those who had come to destroy it. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more hidden histories. See you next time.